Hey everybody, this is Tobin Walsh. I'm the Good Bad Dad. Welcome back. As expected, I'm talking to a great author today and reviewing her latest book. It's Peggy Orenstein, and her new book is called Unraveling. It's a really witty, amazing story about a hobby that she took a little bit further during COVID, and sort of the lessons that we can all learn, and she learned while doing so. So, really cool book. You may know her from her other book. She's a parental expert on talking about sex with your kids. She authored Girls and Sex, Boys and Sex. So, be sure to check out Peggy Orenstein and enjoy this section. Bye bye.
Right now for some reason. Gotten back
It's
into
a
Clue
commitment
from
to play Clue with kids. I mean, well, I guess she's not such a kid anymore, but that's a commitment.
no.
You can go rounds and rounds and rounds. I actually really like Clue. That's a good one.
Yeah. We're big. My husband and I play games every night after dinner. That's
God,
what we do
that's pretty
in our
amazing,
empty nest. Yeah,
man.
that's
That's
our
amazing.
empty nest activity.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you know what's funny is I started trying to communicate with you at least when you were after I heard you on Dax Shepard's podcast, Armchair
Mm.
Expert. So that was like February. I actually listened to it back this morning. Um, and it's weird. Like I'd never listened to a podcast back before, but I sat there as if like that hour just cruised by. It was just such a cool hour you spent with him. He's so amazing. But also the topic was boys and sex, which is of particular
Mm.
interest to me. And I know I did want to ask you some questions about that, but we can do that later, right?
Sure.
Cool. Okay, awesome. Well, let's get to the topic at hand. The reason I got back on your radar, I think you have a new book now out. It's called Unraveling, where I learned while shearing sheep, dyeing wool, and making the world's ugliest sweater. So this is interesting. So I'm preventing the urge, Peggy, to make a terrible dad joke. How you transition from sex to sheep.
I know.
Oh, you've heard this one before.
Well, I haven't, but I'll tell you, I mean, it seems like, oh my God, she went from sex to knitting or sex to sheep. But the truth is that I've always seen my kind of beat as a journalist as being about looking at the unexamined aspects of ordinary life, along my own lifespan. Not that I'm going from sex to sheep necessarily, but that what I was looking at in this book, was my daughter, I was going through, it was the pandemic hit, but I was going through a lot of transition in my life. And this was sort of the gimmick to get me to writing about it, which was, I'm getting older. My daughter's was applying to college, facing the empty nest. My mom had died. My dad had dementia and was in decline, in that sandwich generation. And writing about mothers and daughters and fathers and daughters and all of that. So that's still very much in keeping, I think, with the rest of my work. It's just the sort of gimmick of the going off to shear a sheep that is the occasion for the book. That's a little off brand, maybe.
Yeah, let's just introduce you to the people who don't know. So Peggy Orenstein, prolific writer. I love your work. Prolific in the world of talking to, young adults about sex and parents about how to talk about sex with young adults. But now this new memoir, which I've only gotten through about half of it, okay? So I only got it a couple of days ago and I got through half and it's amazing. Like my first, so as a dad, I'm a middle-aged dad, right? I'm like, I don't know if this is for me. And then you kind of like you're just such a damn good writer that you just suck us in. Like it's almost as like it's a long form bloggy conversation.
Mhm.
Is that just how you write? Is that just years of writing for New York Times and whomever, or this is a special voice that you've introduced for the memoir?
Um, I'm really glad you asked that. It is the way that I write. It's the way I strive to write. Like I really, I've been writing for a long time, but if I go like way, 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 way back to when I first started writing, um, when I got out of school, when I was in school, when I was in college, I was an English major. That's always a good path to a career. And I thought about going into academia. And I thought the way that, and I like this idea that was kind of popular in feminist academia at the time, that you were like supposed to be uh, critiquing the academic life and dismantling the sources of authority and all of that. But then I looked and I was like, yeah, but they're doing it in the exact same language that is used to support authority. So ultimately, it was like just this same completely impenetrable language that was being used anyway and just kept on going. And so I really didn't like that. And I really liked, to me, what I wanted to do in my writing was to reach people. And I thought the best way to reach people is to talk like you normally talk, to write like you talk, to make it conversational, to make it fun, so that even if you're talking about things that are difficult or painful or challenging, which I have, over my career, I've talked, whether it's kids and sex, whether it's talking, I've written a lot about breast cancer. In this case, there's a lot of critique that's kind of complicated, but I always feel like if I can understand it, I can make other people understand it. But things about, the impact of our clothes on the environment and on labor, and why we don't think about our clothes the way we think about food, in terms of like ethics and organics and all that kind of stuff, and the impact of all of that. Like all that stuff, if I can do it the way that I would do it if I was just chatting at a party, I feel like I can get important ideas across to people and make them think and start their own conversations.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this idea. So, you bear the lead in the title, right? So everybody picks up the book and they're going to buy it because this is a really quirky, interesting story that normally doesn't happen. I imagine, right? No suburban person, well, no suburban person that I know has an inkling to go shear a sheep and create a sweater from scratch. So is this something you've always wanted to do? It's like,
I know.
I know you grew up in Minneapolis, right? Like that doesn't have any
Yeah.
farms. You didn't grow up on a farm, I suppose, Like
No,
what's the
although I
deal?
am the granddaughter of homesteaders, so I did grow up
Oh,
with a
that's
lot of
right. You say that in the book.
stories.
You say that. Yep. And
Yeah.
your father was an attorney, so you got back into the kind of city life. But where did this all
Yeah.
come from? Like, have you kind of,
Um,
I'm sure you've been asked that.
I know, and I still haven't developed like a good soundbite answer for it. But I mean, I knit. I've knit since I was a kid,
Okay.
and my mom taught me how to knit, and that's a big part of this too. Is this sort of like passing on of lore and craft and tradition, and the ways that fiber and knitting really are passed from mother to daughter, and how that can be this, like, I mean, it was such a bond with everybody that I talked to who had learned to knit. They all learned from their mother. It was a really something they really thought about fondly. It was something that really connected them, and was for me with my mom, that we didn't always get along so well, but we could always go to the knit store. We could always go to the knit store. So, some of it was the pandemic hit, and I was kind of knitting because I had nothing else to do, and thinking like, who thought of yarn? Like, how did that? And so I kind of wanted to understand where my fiber came from. And I thought, I don't know why I thought it would be fun to go shear. I mean, I don't know where I got that, Toby, to be honest. That just seems like insanity in retrospect.
Well, that's what
But yeah.
I wanted to ask you that. Did you, it's pretty clear you're obviously a novice in the book, right? And you live in
Yeah.
Northern California, which I feel like gave you better access than most people might have to this
Mhm.
activity. But what did you know about even sheep? I don't know anything about
Nothing.
sheep. You really didn't know anything. You know
Nothing.
anything.
No, if I did, I never would have done it, because I would have realized that it was incredibly difficult. Like, it is the hardest thing I have physically, like the physically hardest thing I've
Well,
ever done in my
describe the
life.
size. Okay, so describe the size. So I'm not going to ruin the book for everybody because
Yeah.
I wanted to break this up into a couple of things. So let's just talk about the sheep. Let's talk about the animal.
Okay.
So first of all,
Martha.
disclaimer for the PETA folks out there.
Right.
Shearing sheep does not harm them if done correctly.
No.
We're going to be very clear about that. It actually is a good thing for them. When you see these balls of puff that are going for a world record, that actually is depriving the animal of the ability to eat. So
Yeah.
let's compare that. Okay, so what the sheep? How big? Like, give me a comparison, like to like some kind of like a Saint Bernard maybe or something. Like,
I think maybe a little bigger than that. I mean, I think they're like, I mean, they can range a lot. I think mine was like around 140, 150 pounds. So, I mean, it's a size, it was bigger than I was. I know
yeah, bigger
that.
than you. And then you go on this farm, and then it's like there's a pit. I don't know. And they're smart too. You say they're really smart, so it's not like you can just
They get
go,
a bad
hey,
rap. They get a
okay.
very bad rap, those sheep. They're very smart. They can recognize people 50 faces 2 years after they've met. I don't know how they, like, if they go, hey, sheep goes, hi, Bob. I don't know, but somehow they know that. And they're very bright, but they also are prey animals. So they don't want you. And they're covered with lanolin, that kind of waxy stuff that's in like cosmetics and things. And so they're slippery, and you got to kind of back them up, do this kind of ninja flip thing. Again, doesn't hurt them, but it puts them on their back. And then you're standing there, and they don't really want to be there. It doesn't hurt them, but they don't want to be
Yeah.
there any more than my dog likes it when I clip her. And then you've got a hot whirring blade with no safety, and they've got hooves, so they're like, if they sense any weakness, they'll kick to get free. And so
Did
it
you
was
feel
and
connected
it's
then? Because there was a time I think when I was reading that like you either chopped your finger or something. It was like the
yeah.
initial time you almost maimed your finger, and then you had experts with you, but again, you were doing all this work, and so like you had to become like sort of like relaxed but freaked out. Like, how'd you find that experience?
I don't, the thing is that I always feel like there's Peggy the person, and Peggy the person would have, I think I say this in the book at one point, I would have just thrown that thing down, cursed, cried, and walked away. But when I'm doing my work, but I'm doing this for work. I'm doing it because for an experience, observing myself, writing about it, being a journalist. And it's like I put on a superhero cape, and then I just will do things and um, get past internal obstacles. Oh, that's the dog. Sorry. In a
That's
way
okay.
that I wouldn't otherwise. So there
Like a
was a way that
performance.
I just did it because I had committed to do it. And that's it. I mean, at one point, my teacher, who's a young woman half my age, said, you've got a knack for this. Most people, that's what you said, most people would have been cursing or crying by now. And I said, I would be if I could be, but I can't. I have to just focus.
Yeah, I must say
So
that
it's interesting.
there were numerous times when I was reading about not just the shearing, but I'm all the way through like, geez, I'm going to butcher all these terms. You're going to freak out.
That's all right.
Like spooling and whatever, using the
Mm-hmm.
machine to yarn or I'm so sorry.
Spinning. Mm-hmm.
So probably every single process you describe, I would find myself quitting.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. What the real gift of doing this and of kind of being, I guess, forced to do it because I set myself a task for a book. Over and over, I keep saying, through most of the book, certainly the part that you've read, I'm like, I'm terrible at this. I can't do it. It's not working. I'm such an amateur. I'm never going to get it. Blah 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 blah. And then there's a certain point where I realize that that's what it is. It's the whole, what this is all about. I'm a writer for a living, and that's a creative profession. But when you work in a creative profession, I don't know if you feel this way about podcasting, you're also looking at market, you're looking at readership, you're looking at making a living, at income, like business. It becomes commerce, and it's hard. And that doesn't take, you're still creative, but it erodes some of that creative energy and love and purity. And so doing this, that's why I kind of say on the cover of the book that it's ugly. It's the sweater's not that ugly. I mean, it's okay. But it didn't matter because the whole thing was about remembering that creativity is about process, and remembering that creativity. I use this word at one point, and this is really important for kids and for parents. This gets us back to this. There's this notion called creative mortification. And the idea of it is that when we're kids, when we're little, we have this kind of unbridled creativity, right? We just do stuff, we draw stuff, we don't care. It's just like this pure joy. And then at some point, usually when you're in early elementary school, somebody looks at it, whether it's, your music, or whether it's that you picked up the baseball bat, or whether it's that you draw, whatever it is, they look at it and they critique it too harshly. And you put that thing down and you never do it again. Mortification means death, right? Creative
Yep.
mortification. And you learn to ask two questions. You learn to ask, is this good or does this suck? And those are kind of the death of creative process. That's totally focused on product. And so learning along this way to reframe, this is a really important thing to know as a parent when you're talking to your children. Instead of, is it good? Does it suck? It's what worked about that? What did you like about it? What might have you have done better? What could you have done differently? What would you do next time? And that's all about process. That's all about the joy in doing. And yeah, I mean, if you're going to do it professionally or something, yeah, you want it to be, sellable or whatever. But for most of us, creativity is like a birthright. And it's about finding ways to enrich your life through that birthright, whether what you do is, the best. I mean, I used to think when I was in college, I think, oh, I better not be a writer because I'll never be Charles Dickens, again, English major.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. You do something because it feeds you. And maybe or maybe not, it becomes, big C creativity that you sell in the marketplace. But little C creativity is a really valuable human experience.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I am, it's interesting. I kind of came into this creative space late-ish. I mean, by traditional senses, right? So I didn't start blogging or doing any of this creative stuff until I was well into my 30s when I had, I think after I had my last child, in fact. So I had 5 kids at the time. So it's almost kind of like I'm unraveling that pragmatist, and I'm going
Mm-hmm.
like it's okay not to have like 1 + 2 = 3. You can still get to three doing another way. So it's interesting you say that because I find myself as a parent trying to tell my kids what you just said, but then at times being so caught up and hey, in a half an hour we got to be here. Let's go, let's go, let's go. And it's like, hey, you know, mixed messages all over the place, right?
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, there's two other things about that. One is the other thing that I learned about creativity along the way is that something has to be um, innovative and appropriate. I make this point that like if you if you had to pave your driveway and you did it with salami, that would be innovative but not appropriate, right? So you don't want to be paving the driveway with salami in your creative acts either. But with kids, I think the other thing is that we tend to professionalize what they do so early on these
Yeah.
days.
Yep.
I mean, we know that, right? That's a constant problem in sports, in arts,
Mhm.
in music, in everything that like you can't just, I mean, I feel like when I was a kid, there was more opportunity to just mess around, to just like, if you were going to do
Well,
sports, there was lots of ways to do it. You didn't have to get into that like, professionalized league where it's hyper competitive right away. But that's like, it just robs so much of the joy from our kids' lives.
well, it's interesting because you do mention, and I heard it in the Shepherd interview a year and a half ago that your father was kind of like, "You're gonna go be a writer in New York.
Yeah.
That's not a job." So like, it's an interesting juxtaposition because I'm assuming you and I grew up pretty similarly. I grew up in Iowa, so we have this
Mhm.
Midwestern kind of like you go to college and 4 years later you buy a home and I did all that and I checked all those boxes. What I found was something else, some other itch needed to be scratched. So it's interesting that you have, is that sort of something you think like you gleaned because like sort of this alternative path worked for you and you can kind of go, hey, here is the air of, my dad was great, my parents raised me well, but hey, I said, kind of gave him the middle finger, went to New York and made a
I
success
did.
of myself.
I don't, I think I always have this kind of duality in my head of like, wow, I went down this path. I mean, I'm always checking it against the path I was supposed to go down, right? I mean, I really took a hard turn. And so I'm always like, was it worth it? Did I do it? What did I lost a lot in doing that too. I gave up a lot of family and community. So I guess when with my own child, I think about how can I let her be who she is and develop how she's going to develop without forcing her to make that kind of rupture and rift that I had to make with my family, because there was a lot of pain in that too. And I do write about that in this book. And I write about my dad. I expected this book. I expected Unraveling to really connect me with my mom had died several years earlier. I kind of joke at the beginning of the book that the lockdown hits and I'm like talking to my mom every day, all day, which is weird because she's dead,
Yeah.
but I talk to her in my head. Actually, today is the anniversary of her death. And I talk to her in my head all the time, or I talk to the person I've developed that is her to me now. I'm not even sure that's who she was anymore.
Mhm.
But it's a very comforting person, that person. But I didn't expect that this book would connect me with my dad so much. And my dad was still alive then. He's not now, but he was I couldn't see, he was in Minneapolis. He was in a facility. He had dementia. I couldn't see him. Nobody could see him. It was really hard. And I was communicating and what this allowed me to do, because I was doing these tasks that had this old world quality. So they were very slow. So things like carding fleece, which was interminable to get it ready to spin and boring, took weeks. I could just sit on FaceTime while I was doing it and be with my dad, even though he couldn't really always connect.
Yeah, he said
And
sometimes he would ask you for a glass of water, like you were right next.
yeah, he'd ask me for a glass of water. I'd be like, "Yeah, Dad, I can't reach it. Can you?" Or he would say, like, the twins were playing. They had, twins games where the twins always won on every day, and he didn't realize that they weren't real live. I mean, they were real, but they weren't
Yeah.
live. They were reruns, and he thought they were winning because of something he did with his walker. And I was like, "What is it, Dad? What are you doing? That's making the twins win." And he got this like really sly expression. He said, "Trade secret." He wouldn't tell me.
You know,
So I don't know.
you know
But
what?
what was I was just gonna say what was cool was that we did have a lot of conflict over the course of my life, and he didn't believe. I mean, he later would, eat his words and proudly, that he said I could never be a writer. It was a pipe dream. Stop it. You cannot do this. Don't go to New York. Don't try. He really discouraged me. And later he, would admit that. But we had a lot of conflict over the years. He did not want a feminist daughter. He wanted a traditional daughter. And that time when I could sit with him while I was doing this book and just be, and he no longer, I mean, he was not himself, but he wasn't himself. He was often lost in a different reality. And it was often so difficult, but it also gave me this chance to express this unconditional love that I don't know that I ever would have otherwise had been able to express. And now that he's gone, he died in August, I can't even begin to tell you how precious that time and that opportunity has been to me.
Well, I tell you what, the part of the book that I just passed that almost got me was you talking about, the "You Are My Sunshine" song, and then
Mm.
couple that with him confessing his love to you, and although he was in an altered state, that how much that meant. So I really felt that, and that's kind of the whole deal with this book. Again, it's called Unraveling: What I Learned While Shearing Sheep, Dyeing Wool, and Making the World's Ugliest Sweater. Peggy Orenstein's latest book. It's a memoir, but it's about sheep, sure, and it's about you making an ugly sweater, but it's really about all this other stuff that either you thought about in the process, or or triggered a memory, like you said, your parents. So a couple of things, Peggy. So I'm going to mention a couple of things that I wrote down in my notes, and you just tell me the first thing that comes to mind, like in the context of unraveling. Excuse me. Bodega pastures.
uh Running pastures was where I sheared my sheep, and what was very cool about them was that they were a kind of different sort of ranch, that they were a regenerative ranch, so they were really models in sustainability and what the future of farming should look like. But the other thing was, one of the things that happened there that that's sort of curious, was this idea of there's a lot of apocalyptic theme in the book
Yeah,
because it
yeah,
was
yeah.
during the pandemic, and also the fire. I live in Northern California, so it was the worst fire year. The world seemed pretty dang bad right then. And one of the guys at the ranch goes, says like, "Yeah, when it all comes down, they're going to be coming here. We're the ones that have the sheep, and we can just and a friend of mine said, "You're learning this skill that when the zombie apocalypse comes, you'll get into the last safe community, throw some food over the wall." And I actually printed out, I thought, yeah, I kind of am. And I printed out, just in case, the internet dies when the zombie apocalypse comes, how to build a spinning wheel. But then, so I'm talking about this with my husband at one point in the book, and he says, yeah, there's going to be plenty of clothing when the apocalypse comes. You can just go into the empty stores and grab clothing. There'll be like clothing for like 20 years. If you really want to, do something useful, learn how to butcher meat or medicinal herbs. So what you're doing is completely of no consequence. So it's like,
That's great. I love it. Yeah,
yeah,
you had to have like a moment where it was like, this is both weird and like I found my tribe kind of thing. So
right.
I didn't know what it was, but I thought that was a great idea. And they rule by consensus, which was pretty cool. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
How
And the whole
about
regenerative agriculture thing. I mean, especially, I mean, you're from
yeah,
Iowa, right? I mean, it was a very, I liked one of the things that I did with this, but I really tried to put in some of those alternative ideas of like I'm not just going to go to a sheep ranch where they're massively shearing sheep and nobody cares. I want to see what it means to do this in a way that is good for the planet. I want to know what we're doing, how we're treating our animals. I want to know what it means about our clothing. I want to know all these things. So I was always kind of, and the other thing was the teachers that I have through the book, I wanted to challenge ideas of who does this kind of work. So although the only time I actually actively say it is with the shearing teacher, because she's female and only 5% of shearers are female. And I really wanted to learn from a woman because I thought with upper body strength and everything, they would understand that better. But everybody in the book is a little different than the person that you would expect to be like knitting and doing. It's me, right? Middle-aged white lady, straight, kids, all that kind of stuff. So everybody else is a little bit different than that because I wanted to show the diversity of who does all of these things.
Yeah, and that just happened because of where the universe led you to do these activities?
No, I actively wanted to do that.
Oh, okay.
Except for with Laura, the shearer. I mean, with Laura is the only time I say something, the shearing teacher, because I'm talking about the masculinity of the field and finding this woman teacher. But the rest of the time I thought, no, I really wanted to, I didn't need to make a deal out of it, but I wanted to say, everybody thinks that people who do all these things look a certain way, live a certain way, have a certain demographic. And I thought, they don't is the thing. So let's shake it up. And even if people don't really clock it, it's there.
So is this so a memoir versus the nonfiction stuff that you've done in your TED Talk and everything like that?
Mm-hmm.
So not only in interviews like this, but just in general, is it just kind of strange conducting these interviews and kind of having me talk about actually like what things you did and not, output of interviews and years of research?
Well, I did do another memoir some years ago, and it was about the years that we spent trying to have our daughter, which were years of infertility and also breast cancer and some other stuff that was going on with me. So in some ways, that was, when I did that book, it was called Waiting for Daisy. I really, I was I needed to do the book. Like for me, I had to do it as a writer and as a person. It just was I was compelled. I didn't think that much about what would happen when it was published and how people would be in like reviews saying whether they liked me or like, she's a very, she does this awful thing. I don't like her. She was, and I just think, whoa, you don't know me, or like people talking about my sex life and, like all this, that was a little, shocking to me. And so this, by comparison, although there's a lot that's personal about my relationship with my mom and my dad and stuff that's going on in my head about aging and about parenting, I'm not talking about my sex life, Toby. So it feels very private.
You were used to the vulnerability. Well, that's an interesting question because I guess you're such a person that talks so plainly about things. It feels like it's personal experience anyways, right? Because even when I've heard you talk about your other books, it's kind of like, well, this one guy told me, and it feels like you're sitting on the couch next to somebody going like, you wouldn't believe what this guy told me, blah, blah. And that's just a tribute to how you write these things. It's amazing.
Thank you.
I found to
well,
be,
it's also,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say it's back to that conversational thing, and also the idea that when I write, I really and report, I really try not to feel like I'm this expert talking to you from on high. Like I'm just a person I don't know anything, I'm just going through this. I have questions in life, and then I go out and ask 200 people to find out what's going on. That's my job. But and then I bring it back. But when I'm doing it, I'm as sort of curious and clueless and trying to learn as my reader. So I feel like I am sitting next to you on the couch. I'm not standing up at the lectern. I'm like with it. I'm with you in it. And so I'm glad that you pick up on that because it's really important to me to be like that.
Yeah, it brings a memoir sort of into 3 dimension, right? I mean, a memoir can be pretty self-aggrandizing and where it's like, oh God, if I have to read about another hit this artist has, or, the cool person they had lunch with yesterday. But this is like, it's almost self-deprecating in a way,
Yeah. I mean, most of the jokes are at my expense.
Yeah, it's hardening. I love it. Well, so what did you have to, since it was a little bit different, at least, in recent past and what you become kind of renowned for on whether it's speaking circuits or with school districts, sex ed and stuff, did you have to pitch this any harder, or did anybody question whether or not you actually had a book here? It's like, I mean, I don't know. When you're
Yeah.
New York, I've talked to couple other New York Times bestseller people, and it's kind of like one or two. One side is, oh, whatever I come up with, they're pretty much, but it's usually in a narrow road, right? So when you
Right.
kind of expand the road with, do they get a little skeptical, or are you able to just go, they just go?
Yeah. Really good question. Because I always pitch a couple of books when I'm trying to do something, and usually one of them is kind of an oddball thing, and one of them is more on brand, and they're always like, "Yeah, let's do the like." I have for a long time I wanted to, and now my moment has passed because everybody has died. But I really wanted to write. I mentioned earlier that I'm from a family of homesteaders, and I'm Jewish, and it's kind of an unusual background to be a Jewish person with great grandparents that homesteaded in North Dakota, and there's a story there, and so for a while I was like, I want to write about the North Dakota Jewish experience, or I'll write girls and sex, and they were like, yeah, girls and sex, but so when I came up with this idea, so I had just Boys and Sex had just come out, and I had done the tour, the first part of the tour. And what happens usually after that is that you start doing speaking engagements. And I was actually on my way to my first speaking engagements in Los Angeles. I was doing three, and it was March, and I turned March 2020, and I turned the car around on the way to the airport, and I called and said, I can't do it. And they were really upset and disappointed. And within 4 days after that, lockdown had happened.
Um,
So there I was, and it felt a little, I mean, you know, it was shocking for everybody. Everybody had their life upended. For me, my work stopped and I had nothing to do. And I didn't have a new book that I was working on. So, I mean, if I'd been in like a writing phase, probably I wouldn't have even really noticed the pandemic. But, I was just sitting there going, oh God, I have no book, no work, no income. I'm just sitting here like terrified. And so I was talking to my agent, and I said, almost in like this little tiny voice, kind of like, oh, well, I do have this one kind of thing. And I thought they would just mock me, like with the Dakota book, and which really would have been a good book. But I think because everybody at that moment had started baking sourdough and, doing their pottery and like whatever, everybody started immediately doing crafts right during the
yeah.
pandemic, so it felt really relevant all of a sudden. And it was before, I think, if it had been a few months later, when things got more political, and when the racial justice issues rose up, and everybody became very coalesced around that, and that became very urgent. I'm not sure that they would have been so game on it, but it was just in this kind of, just by luck, in this little window where all anybody was thinking about was their crafting projects.
Were you off now? So the book came out this week as we record this.
Yeah.
So are you now off to the speaking circuit, or has that changed completely from COVID? Are you doing more Zooming or?
Well, I mean, I'm still doing a lot. I mean, my speaking stuff is still really around teenagers and sexuality.
Okay.
And I still am doing some of that live. This book, I don't think it has that same kind of speaking thing, but the one thing that has really changed is that what used to happen I mean, this is very inside baseball, but I used to go around the country, and, do events. And that was such a joy because I
Yeah.
got to see and meet readers, and it was a lot of energy. And also, especially with the teenagers and sex book, people would tell me things that you don't hear unless you're in person. Like a boy, I met this boy who was, or he was a man really. He was a Division I basketball player, and he came up to me at a reading and said that he was really disturbed by the amount of misogynist locker room talk that he heard, and he wanted some advice on what to do about that. And he said, the thing is, and I never would have thought of this because I'm not an athlete, but he said, you go out on the court, and these guys are your team. You have to be united. You have to get along. And if you're back in the locker criticizing them for the way that they talk, that puts division in there, and that's going to be a problem on the court. So I have that to think about too. And it was a really interesting conversation, and then we ended up emailing after that for a while. Or another boy who same tour, who came up to me, and he was sort of like almost vibrating, and he said, I heard what you said about masculinity and emotional suppression, and I wanted to know. He was 15, I think, or 16. He said, I want to know if you think it's bad that I haven't. It was January, right? And he said, my best friend died in September, and I haven't cried. Do you think that's bad? And I was like, okay, this is a book signing line.
Wow.
A little hard to address,
Wow.
but I said, I'd like you to, if you want to just, if you want to talk about this, I'm happy to talk about it. I gave him my email address, and we ended up having, and it turned out that his friend had died by suicide. And there was, so much was going on for this poor guy, and he was holding this all in. And we went back and forth a few, and I'm not a therapist, but I said, I really think you need to be talking to an adult in your life, and probably you need to ask your parents to get a therapist. And that doesn't mean that you're going to be talking about how you hate your mother. That's not what therapy is, and to be he was like, I'm trying to be the role model for my friends around this by being strong. And I said, how you be the role model for your friends around this is you allow yourself emotion and vulnerability, and you recognize that when you've suffered this kind of a loss, that you need support. That's how you role model to your friends, not by trying to white knuckle through it. And I wouldn't have had that opportunity if I couldn't do an in-person event. So, and with this, it's a little different. I'm hearing people's stories, but I'm hearing people's stories about their mothers, about their fathers, about their learning craft. And I'm not getting to do that in the same way, but I'm just doing a few events in the Bay Area.
Okay, well that's good. I mean, yeah, I imagine you get a couple different things like, oh, I spent COVID doing this, or I'm a crafter. That was really cool. Like I've always thought about this. My mother knitted, blah blah. But the multiple angles of this thing is what's really captivating about the memoir, because it just goes in all different directions. It's not necessarily something for crafters only, or somebody looking to do a really quirky, well-written story about how somebody spent an interesting COVID stint. It's like equal combinations, like process engineering, frustration, human condition, learning new stuff. I mean, it's really quite a cool lesson for any adult, right?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm also hearing a lot about. It's funny that you mentioned the "You Are My Sunshine" thing, which is that I talk about how my dad, who had forgotten so much about his life, because it's stored in a different part of your brain. Apparently, this is like a scientific phenomenon. People with dementia or Alzheimer often remember song lyrics, and the song lyrics can like sort of pop them back. And my dad could remember every song. And what he loved was I would sing "You Are My Sunshine," which I still can't sing without crying. And a lot of people, especially if they're around my age, their parents loved that song. It would be like, if you sang a Beatles song to a certain generation, if you sang "Yesterday," people would be like, my parents loved that, and so a lot of people are saying, when I read that part, I cried, or, like there's a lot of that. But I think with all the books, and this one in particular, I think about braiding stories. And so this one, there's the fat braid that's just the silliness of going off and shearing a sheep and learning how to dye, learning how to do all these things, and the creativity. And that's fun, and that's silly, and that's kooky. But then there's also, history and lore and environmental stuff. And then there's also this personal story of what it means to be an adult, and what it means to be aging, and what it means to be in a family, and to be raising a teenager, and to be dealing with parents, and be doing all that during the pandemic, or just generally. And so to me, it's going back and forth among all those things over and over that makes the book work, I think.
Man, I love it. I can't wait to get through it. When I do, I'll send you a note, tell you how much I love the rest of it. And we have to do like a parenting podcast thing. When your schedule simmers down, you and I are getting back together, okay?
Okay. That's
promise. I'm going to hold you to it. It's on camera now, so.
All right. I will.
Thanks so much for making the time. I really appreciate it. Like I said, it was an absolute thrill for me, and there's so much more to endeavor upon between us. All right.